All right. I'd like to welcome everybody to the MIDAS seminar series. Today, we are excited to have with us David Shor, who, after his undergraduate at the Florida International University in Miami, started a company to figure out politics and did well enough with it that he was part of Barack Obama's campaign and a senior analyst at Civis Analytics, and is the leading, perhaps the leading data scientist dealing with campaigns of the Democratic Party. He has been in the news lately for speaking the truth to power, and we are really delighted that he's taking the time to spend with us at such an exciting time for the country and for the use of data science tools in politics. So without further ado, take it away, David.
All right, and I just want to confirm that everyone can hear me and everything's all right.
All good.
Okay, all right. So I am going to now share my screen, and all right. Okay. All right. Sorry, presenting. All right, so today we're going to talk, and also thank you for the great introduction. Today we're going to talk about data and the 2020 election. It's a little bit of a scattered talk. I swear it all makes sense together. So first, we're going to talk about 2016, what happened in 2016, and then different ways to cut that up. And then from there, we are going to, talk about some international context about what's happening, pivot to talking about 2018, and then a little bit about what to expect in 2020. So the first thing is just to center over what obviously has been the biggest political event in the last in the last 4 years, which is the 2016 presidential election. So the first thing about the 2016 presidential election is that when you look at things from a county level perspective, 2018 was really monocausal in some way. I think the story of the 2016 election, we're gonna, show different cuts of the same thing, but this really gets to the heart of what happened. So this is a scatter plot. Every single dot is a county, and the x-axis is the share of individuals with a bachelor's degree, and the y-axis is change in support from 2012. This is restricted to majority white counties, and what you can see is that basically what happened in 2016 is that areas with lower levels of educational attainment swung heavily against Democrats, while areas with high levels of educational attainment swung heavily toward Democrats. This is very unusual. If you made a plot like this for 2008 versus 2012, it would have been relatively flat in comparison. There are some long-running trends. It's very weird for both the magnitude of the county level changes that we saw were historically unusual, at least in the context of the, in the past 30 years where things have been pretty stable. And on top of that, the extent to which you can explain so much of the variance with only one variable, the extent to which this is monocausal, is really also pretty unusual. Just from a statistical perspective, education alone explains something like 70% of the variance in county level swing. And if you tried to do a similar regression with similar controls in 2012, you would get like 10%. So it is unusual. So another way to look at this is the same graph, but looking at presidential election results versus Senate election results the same year. And what you could see is that this education gradient is like kind of there on the Senate, but really largely not. It's pretty flat. And this was really, constant. This was a phenomena only seen in presidential races, even though this did reverberate down ballot, in 2018. And so this tells you, I think, that this really does hammer out that this wasn't like that the economy was bad and people like swung against people turned against Democrats. This was something very specifically about Donald Trump and Donald Trump's message. There were in a lot of these counties, which you see over here, where we dropped by 15% of the vote. A lot of those places, still voted Democratic for House or Senate or governor in 2016, and so it wasn't that their views of the party changed. This was, something specifically about Trump. Or you could argue Hillary, but I think in the context of what's happened since then, it's clear it was about Trump. So, just to provide some context, some color about some of these places that swung so heavily against Democrats, this is a town called Hayside, Virginia. The origin story of this town is that in order to get there, it's right on the tri-point between Virginia, Kentucky, and West Virginia, high up in the mountains, but on the Virginia side of the tri-point. In order to get there, historically, you needed to cross a ferry. The ferry was run by a guy named Silas. He would scream, "Hey, Si," and then the ferry would come, and that's why it's called Hayside. So it historically was an extremely democratic town. They had a history of very militant coal unions and industrial disputes going back to the 20s. And so it was a roughly 70 to 80% democratic town going back decades. McGovern won it, Mondale won it, and Obama got, I think about 78% there. Flash forward to 2016, Hillary Clinton gets 23% of the vote in Hayside, Virginia. So the other key thing about this education realignment is that while some of it was visible, while people talked about it, the educational realignment ended up being substantially larger than people thought. And here what we can see is this is showing polling averages versus the actual election results. And what you could see is that even though nationally it was roughly correct, the polling error was really concentrated in these kind of low education Midwestern states. And that's, the polls were wrong there. And so the question is why? So the first reason that people gave for this kind of thing, and also for this graph, was to say, oh, it must have been that Donald Trump really turned out all of these people. He really has this base of non-college educated whites, and they all turned out in droves to vote for him. And it turns out that's not really true. And so just to talk about how we know that, basically whether or not you vote is a matter of public record. Obviously, who you vote for is a secret and not stored anywhere. But administrative vote history keeps track of which individuals vote and which individuals don't. Tell your friends. There's an election coming up, so let people know that their vote is public. But the flip side of that is this means that you can actually look and combine, if you do proper modeling and combine with the millions of surveys that we've done, you can decompose change in support into changes in who voted, versus people actually changing their mind. And this, kind of ugly plot that's from Excel in 2016, basically shows that by state. And what you can see here is that changes in people changing their mind is a much larger driver of the 2012 to 2016 shifts than changes in turnout, with a couple of notable exceptions. What you can see, in Oregon, for example, you can see there was a fairly large change in turnout due to them implementing automatic voter registration. While in Wisconsin and Mississippi, there were relatively large turnout declines among Democrats, and that arguably was linked to the voter ID laws that Republicans pushed through in those two places. But for the most part, this was a matter of people changing their minds and not a matter of turnout. So the question is, why didn't people see it coming? And why did we see this? Why didn't we see this pattern of us overperforming? The polls being wrong in these kind of low education areas, if it wasn't that the low education proportions were wrong. And so here, I'm going to talk a little bit about social trust. So social trust is operational. When political scientists talk about it, it's operationalized in this question that's asked in the GSS, or General Social Survey, which is, do you think that people can generally be trusted? And the GSS, it's a very expensive government survey. They spend thousands of dollars per person. And so they have a response rate of about 80%, so we can actually trust their numbers. Basically, when you ask people, do you think that people can generally be trusted, or do you think people should keep to themselves? Only 30% of people say that people can generally be trusted. And that percent has been actually precipitously declining by about 1% per year for the last 40 years, probably concerning, but outside the scope of this talk. And so, why does that matter? It turns out that answering phone surveys is very heavily correlated with whether or not you trust your neighbors and social trust. And so here, what this plot is showing is this is showing change in support from 2012 to 2016 by college and non-college and social trust. And so what you could see is that among the people who have trust, among high social trust people who say that people can be trusted, Clinton overperformed Obama substantially among both college whites and non-college whites. But among people who don't trust their neighbors, and keep in mind, this is a group that is substantially less likely to answer surveys, this group swung, especially among non-college whites, swung heavily against Trump. And so, what you can see is this bucket over here is the surveys that we all saw, but there was this missing 20% of the electorate or so that was low social trust and wasn't answering surveys, and they swung heavily against us. And because they weren't taking surveys, we didn't even know. And so, low social trust people have always answered surveys less. But it used to be that how you voted, whether or not you trusted your neighbors wasn't a very salient characteristic. It wasn't very predictive of support once you controlled for other things like race and education. But now, 2016 was like kind of a referendum on how much you trust people and institutions around you versus 2012, which was much more of a referendum on whether or not people should have universal healthcare. So just to cut things up a different way, we did it by social trust, we did it by education. Here is something I like to say is that on paper, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and Mitt Romney and Donald Trump all shared the same positions, on paper. But despite that, what we could see, what this plot is showing is this is showing Obama vote share and Clinton two-way vote share by support for universal healthcare and support for amnesty. And I like to say that this table is like the election in a nutshell, which is that there were a large number of people with conservative views on immigration, but center-left views on economic policy. And Obama actually did very well among this group. And to be clear, demographically, they're generally of lower educational attainment. They are disproportionately white. They live in the Midwest and they're over concentrated in swing states. Obama got 60% of this group, while Clinton got 41%. We obviously gained among the reverse of people who support, have liberal views on immigration, but conservative economic policy, but there are far fewer of them, unfortunately. And so ends up netting out in a bad way. So another quick detour on 2016 is, we noticed that views on issues, issues, declined. The correlation between voting and issue views declined, and I think something probably has something to do with this. Why is it that the electorate became less correlated with, how you voted became less correlated with healthcare than before? And so this is something from the Wesleyan Project. It's basically just showing a breakdown of ads by side. What you can see is historically, Democrats ran a lot of issue-focused ads, particularly around healthcare and taxes. And 2016 was an election where they, had a very unusual number of personal attacks on Donald Trump. And, that I think that is an important thing to remember about that campaign. So zooming out a little bit to a broader, broader context, I think that probably the most important trend of the last 70 years or so is that educational attainment is substantially higher than it's been at any point in US history. If you look at coming out of 1940, something like 4 to 5% of the electorate had a college degree. That number is now closer to 40. The previously most common educational category was not having graduated high school, and now that is the least common educational category. The sea change is pretty wide. And I think related to this, we've seen that as the educational attainment of the population has increased, the electoral salience of education has changed. So this is a plot from Piketty's new book, which is basically showing the gap between college-educated and non-college educated voters over time in the US and Britain and France. And what you can see is, one, there have been steadily increasing trends. This is a secular thing. I think that in my field and also among activists, it's really easy to blame everything on Bill Clinton or on the Watergate babies or us turning our back on labor. But like broadly speaking, there's this broader trend that is driving this educational polarization that's bringing college educated people into the party and pushing non-college educated people out. And it's important to realize that this is both happening everywhere and that it's been happening for a long time. That said, if you look at this little blue chart, you could see that this jump from 2012 to 2016 was quite large. It was probably the largest single increase, except for McGovern. And so that's it was larger than normal, but these are some long-term trends. You could argue in some ways that Barack Obama was really pretty unusual and keeping a very perhaps in the context of the recession, he had a very economics focused message, and there was a relative depolarization by education, and this is just us returning to trend. So just another way to cut out this trend and what it practically means is if you look at historically, and when I say historically, I mean as recently as 15 years ago, racial resentment and measures of racial resentment and partisanship used to be completely uncorrelated with each other. Like if you go back to 1985, or to the OJ verdict, controlling for race, there's basically almost zero gap, in racial attitudes between parties. It's hard to imagine today because this is what this graph looks like now. And these tables are from 2013 and 2014. If you made them now, the gaps would be even larger. So the question is why did this happen? And I think that a lot of people like to tell this story of asymmetric polarization on the Republican side, that the Republicans have gotten crazy. And so I think that another way to look at this this is the percentage of people who say that immigrants strengthen our country. And what's interesting is as recently as 2005, there was no gap on these issues. And this is something, if you have any older, all of us, everyone, I mean, I was a teenager in 2005, but all the people older, all the Democrats who are in their 50s, they all had conservative views on immigration, 20 years ago. They don't remember it, they might deny it, but they all did. And that's something that I think is very funny. And so what's happened since then is that Republicans haven't really gotten more conservative. It's not necessarily that there's been realignment so much as Democrats have gotten much more liberal on this issue and on other similar issues. And so I think that is an underrated, asymmetric polarization aspect to this. And so another way to look at this is that historically, if you go back to the 80s or 90s, raising immigration levels was toxically unpopular. Here, this is just showing a long-term time series. You're looking at 6% of people saying that they want more immigrants, higher immigration levels than the status quo. That's legalizing heroin polls around 12%. It used to be a very toxically unpopular issue, but when people look at things like Trump getting elected, they talk about there being a backlash or these cosmopolitan values getting less popular, but they're actually more popular than ever. This is the zooming forward to last year, a pretty close to even number of people want to increase immigration rather than decrease it. And that would have been unthinkable even 15 years ago. The problem is that the US has a horrible electoral system. And so as a result, these increases in cosmopolitan values are happening in places that aren't close, but triggering backlash in places that are close. And so just to explain this graph, this is showing the relative partisanship of states. You take a state and you subtract the national mean over time for Ohio and Texas. And what you could see is that historically, Ohio has been a pretty close swing state, and then suddenly became not a swing state, along with most of the other swing states in the Midwest. While in Texas, and also other states that weren't close, like California or or New York, or places like, or Massachusetts, we saw massive increases in support. And so due to the structure of us overweighting, this is overweighting, the rural areas and places with lots of non-college educated whites, this hasn't worked out super well for Democrats, but these views are getting more popular every day. So zooming forward to 2018, the first thing I want to say about 2018 is that turnout was really high. This is very unusual, the highest midterm turnout increase I think to literally ever happen. But despite that, of roughly 80%, roughly 75 to 80% of the change from 2016 to 2018 was still people changing their minds. This is the same plot as before, just for 2016 versus 2018, and not changes in who voted. And basically what that tells you is even though turnout increased by an enormous amount, it actually increased by roughly equal levels for both Democrats and Republicans, which is actually usually how mobilization works, and kind of, which is super interesting. It's not that liberals were like really excited. Turnout was really high because everyone cares a lot more about politics than they used to in midterms, and that's like even relative to 2014, and that's really interesting. So then just to break this out by subgroup, basically here what we're showing is just change in support from Clinton to the Senate Democrat in 2018. And there's a couple of clear patterns. The first is that there was a little bit of mean reversion where we did a lot better among non-college educated whites relative to 2016. Like roughly speaking, we think that roughly a third of Obama to Trump voters ended up voting Democratic, in 2018, somewhere in the 30 to 40% range. And so that meant that we saw outsized gains among non-college educated whites, but also, increases among college educated whites. The one thing we saw pretty consistently across races was that Democrats generally did worse than Clinton among non-white voters. And this was true in almost every state. 2016, I think an interesting corollary to the Trump era is that from 1988, all the way out to 2012, racial polarization, just defined as the gap between white and non-white voters in terms of Democratic two-way, increased steadily every single year. And what's really interesting is that 2016 actually was the first year where that stopped being true, where the gap between white and non-white voters was lower than the election before. And so a lot of people wrote that off as a quirk of Obama not being on the ballot, but I think it is pretty notable that in 2018, non-white voters generally were continued to trend, even relative to 2016, toward Republicans. In this case, what you see is, white voters trending toward Democrats. If you average that out, probably something like 3 to 4%. While 4%, the average is right there for me. While non-white voters actually declined by 0.5%. And these declines were pretty meaningful. If Senator Nelson in Florida had done as well among non-white voters as Clinton, I suppose then he would have won. If Stacey Abrams hadn't done worse than Clinton among Black voters, then she would have made the runoff. And so this is all actually pretty meaningful stuff. And it's actually been, as far as we can see in the 2020 data and in the 2020 primary data, all indications continue that this trend is continuing and that non-white voters are going to continue to trend against Democrats, at least in relative terms. So moving on to the next slide, just to talk about 2020 for a little bit. The first thing is coming out of 2018. 2018 was a good year for Democrats, and a lot of people wanted that to be a sign of optimism. And the important thing is that there's no correlation historically between how well a midterm goes for the party in power versus party out of power versus how they do in the next presidential election. Intuitively, 1994 was really bad, 2010 was really bad for Democrats, but then 1996 and 2012 were just fine. And so next slide. Another way to look at this is special elections. There are special elections happening all the time, all throughout the country, for state legislative and congressional races. And so something that, political nerds like to do is they like to analyze basically the election results relative to some baseline, and they create, like an index from it. This is actually from Daily Kos Elections, which they do excellent work. I think this was Daniel Donner. And you could see as in 2017 and 2018, we were really overperforming incredibly and winning every special. But since the 2018 election, things really have, kind of returned to earth, and things are consistent with like a relatively even national environment. The next thing, this slide is pre-COVID, if you just want to get a sense of where the fundamentals are, or at least where they were pre-COVID, here's a matrix where we have GDP and presidential net approval. And the basic idea is that we, if you do a simple regression on the, past, I don't know, 10, all the post-war elections, and you just do a simple regression where you have presidential net approval, and then, quarterly exponentially weighted GDP growth. It's a pretty decent toy model. And if you did this in February prior to coronavirus, you would have gotten a prediction of about 52% of the two-way vote, which is fun because 51.6 is roughly the break-even point where we probably would have won the Electoral College in 2016. So up until COVID, now GDP growth is like a weird postmodern number. It's unclear what economic fundamentals would mean, but going into the pandemic, the fundamentals were consistent with a pretty even race. In the same way, this was a polling average from also from, I think, February, where where it was also pretty consistent with both the close race and the fundamentals. Since then, Biden is doing a little better, but not by a ton. So it's just important to remember that's all. This election is probably going to be pretty close. Obviously in the summer things were up, but the fundamentals point to a close election, and that means that things will probably mean revert in that direction. So the next thing, I'm just going to talk a little bit about data science. And so this is actually a picture from the Cave in 2012, the Obama analytics team. There's a much younger version of me, just kind of hanging out there. So basically, and I'll try to run through this really fast. So basically in politics, we have kind of a boring, unromantic view of things, which is that politics comes down to what races are close, what messaging should you base your campaign on, and what content works, and then how do you actually do the targeting once you decide what works and what doesn't. And our basic thesis coming out of 2016 was that the key way that people answered these questions were all kind of broken. Survey response rates have got so low. Surveys clearly didn't work very well anymore, at least using traditional methods. Campaigns would decide what ads to use and what messages to use based on focus, talking to 6 random people or focus groups, or just whatever fundraised the best, which is the worst thing. And then, campaign targeting was built around mail and door knocks in a world where, it's not in a digital world. So first thing is in 2018, it was really the first cycle where we did large scale RCTs of advertisements. And I'm not going to talk too much about the methods there, but one of the things that we found was that roughly 1 in 5 ads that we tested made people want to vote for Republicans. So that's a really underrated theory of change, which is identify the ads which make people not want to vote for you and don't show them. And so something I think was really interesting about this was we found that basically the more people in the office liked the ads, the less well they did. And the basic reason for this is that people who work in political campaigns are very weird. They're hyper educated. They live in cities. They're usually very young. They're also disproportionately white. And if you look at, Democrats are trying to do 2 things, which is they're trying to persuade, swing voters, moderate swing voters who to vote for them, and they're trying to, get politically apathetic young people to decide to turn out to vote. And political campaign staffers are very disconnected from both sets of people. And one of the things that's really powerful about, actually testing things in large scale measurement is that it kind of allows us to counteract or alleviate some of these biases that are there. And so just to give an example, we actually rolled this out for the first time for the Doug Jones Senate race, And one of the things we found was that, and hold on, I have to charge my laptop's about to die, sorry. One of the things we found was that originally we had set up this whole marketing campaign, or one of our clients had set up a big marketing campaign set around Donald Trump and around Roy Moore and around all of this negative stuff about Roy Moore. And basically what we found was that a lot of that stuff that really inspired or got liberals riled up actually was demotivating. Talking about talking about racist things that Roy Moore had done actually decreased African-American vote likelihood. And actually the thing that worked really well was very straightforward communication about policies Doug Jones supported that would help people go to college and get good jobs. And that's like really interesting because in politics, people really like to create this trade-off where in order to persuade swing voters, you have to talk about economic issues, but in order to mobilize young people of color, you have to talk about these cultural issues. And it turns out what we testing is show that there is no trade-off. Actually, it turns out talking about economic issues is just strictly better for everyone, which is very fun. All right, and so next thing on this, on this topic, and I think this is the last slide or the second to last slide. I know I'm over time. So what this is showing is there's two graphs here. The first is from a conjoint experiment where we, for I think 2 million people or so, we said, suppose there's a Democrat running against Donald Trump on X and Y, would you vote for the Democrat or would you vote for Trump? And what we're looking here is what's the effect of bringing up the issue relative to not bringing up the issue. And the other are ad tests, which kind of are various attacks against Donald Trump. And what we can, and basically what you can see, I mean, is that talking about concrete issues that Democrats support on average does about 3 to 4 times better than attacks on Donald Trump. This is like kind of the story of this election, is that attacks on Donald Trump are very ineffective. People generally have pretty fixed views on Trump, but telling people the Democrats want to expand Social Security or that they want to hire more teachers still does move people and is a substantially better use of time than attacking Trump. And just to talk about these arrows, one of the things that comes out of this from this conjoint experiment is that there's a lot of variance by issues. Talking about impeachment or talking about immigration tends to cause backlash or not cause much of an effect. But there are lots of, but talking about, mental health or Social Security expansion or, other economic issues tends to do pretty well. So that's it. Time for Q&A.
Thank you, David. That was really amazing. We've got several questions already teed up in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and I can help read them for you. And I encourage other people to post to the Q&A box, or if you can't get there, post them on chat, and I'll make sure to get them. Also, before we get to the Q&A and while you're teeing up questions, I want to point out that next week our speaker is Chris Ray from Stanford, who's done a lot of stuff in terms of mining data from non-traditional sources. And this technology has been tremendously useful in a number of different applications and a number of different disciplines, including in helping to catch human traffickers. So see you all next week too. And here we go. We've got a zillion questions here, David. So the first one is, were the education level based plots adjusted for income levels and other indicators of socioeconomic status? These are the ones you showed near the beginning of your talk.
Yeah, I'll go back to it. So this is what I think there's a real point here that I think is very interesting, which is that like people, there's a lot of ideological motivation to create materialist explanations for what happened. And generally, first on a county level, it's very education is just a much stronger predictor of support than income. On a county level, once you control for education and population density, income has basically no effect. You know, academically, if you want to find various globalization indexes or trade disruption, you can find very small effects. But really, the bulk of this really had nothing to do. You know, in general, materialist explanations, you know, for these switches don't, you know, have a ton of water. And my favorite individual level regression is if you do a regression on individual level for predicting swing from Obama to Trump. Basically, the biggest predictor is education, but if you include as a control a racial resentment index, then the education correlation completely disappears. And you know, before I talk about that, I just want to say, you know, when you look at the scatter plot and when you look at the map, it is true in some sense that, you know, the Midwest experienced trade disruption, and that, you know, there's various negative aspects of, you know, neoliberalism, as my friends would, or as I would call it, and somewhere else have been bad. But there's actually been a ton of variance. You know, one example is like the areas around Grand Rapids. You know, a lot of furniture manufacturing. They actually experienced an economic boom over the Obama years. If you look at Eastern Iowa, you know, under Obama, Eastern Iowa was exporting tons of soybeans to China. And so economically, they actually had very low unemployment rates on the order of like 2%. But the flip side is that there were other areas, you know, parts of Indiana that had seriously deindustrialized. And if you look, both the places that experienced tons of economic harm and the areas that were booming both basically swung toward Republicans to the same extent. There was very little, it wasn't really much of a gradient at all if you look at the data. And I think the answer for this goes back to this racial resentment index, which is the story of 2016 is that, and of this education thing, is that there are a bunch non-college educated whites are more hostile of immigration than educated whites. For what it's worth, it's true. At least the education effect is also there among Hispanic and Black and Asian voters. But there's a strong, and so basically, there's this large mass of non-college educated whites with relatively conservative views on immigration, but very liberal views on you know, healthcare. And this also correlates with most academic racial resentment indicators. And in 2012, both parties talked a lot about healthcare. And so as a result, party vote choice was fairly correlated with your views on healthcare. And in 2016, both parties decided to talk a lot about immigration. And that led to the correlation with immigration to go up. I don't think that there's a materialist aspect to this. It's not that like there was a recession and then all of these people turned toward Trump. I think it was just that the media decided to talk a lot more about immigration, and as a result, people voted more on immigration. And that produced, and that combined with the covariance structure between education and income and racial resentment and all this stuff produced the results that we have.
So how do you measure the vote likelihood in the Alabama Senate RCTs?
There are two big indicators. There's two big indicators we looked at. You know, first is like self-reported likelihood to vote. Obviously, people overstate their likelihood to vote, but if you're doing an RCT and your treatment increases the likelihood to vote, that's probably good. And then the other is in follow-ups, you know, we do validation to see if people know when the election is. Something that's really interesting about, you know, about get out the vote versus support, you know, persuasion, is that it's much more, you know, it's much less about attitude change. People generally want to vote, and it's a lot more about giving people information and making sure they remember it. And so a lot of what we're trying to do is make sure people remember, like especially in a special election, a lot of the game is like trying to make sure people remember when the election is. And that's why if you look back at those ads, there's just they really just keep flashing the date, and they're like really saying, oh, remember to vote on, December 11th or whatever it is. But those are the two DVs that people look at for get out the vote messaging.
Do celebrity endorsements work? Some of them seem like they have negative ATE. And which celebrity would you suspect has the highest ATE, and why is The Rock?
I think that stepping back from celebrity endorsements per se, I think the biggest thing about both swing voters and get out the vote, and both people who campaigns want to turn out to vote, and people who campaigns want to persuade, is that they don't care very much about politics. This is the biggest cognitive bias I think that people in my industry have when they talk about things, is that most people who they talk to about politics, including their parents who might politically disagree with them, are with people who care about politics. And particularly, given how educated they are. Something I think is really interesting is just like, if you look at undecided voters, there are more non-white undecided voters than college educated white undecided voters. But the actual groups of people who decide elections are wildly care a lot less about politics and also consume a lot less political content. And so as a result, if you can get, it's very hard for campaigns to reach them. They can buy advertisements, but people do tend to tune out advertisements. And so if you can get people to talk about you in a positive way, in a way that will break through to these people who don't vote very much and who don't consume political content, then that's worth an enormous amount. Like in campaigns, some of the highest value stuff is like getting, if you look at like what successful politicians do in the past, they'll like call into sports shows, they'll try to get DJs to give them a shout out, or they'll try to get, local newspapers to talk about people. And so when you look at celebrities, I think that one, if you have someone like Taylor Swift, who's a Democrat, so if you have someone like Taylor Swift, and even though most people who follow these celebrities are going to be Democrats, one, having, people who have a platform go out and like tell people that they should go vote, that's going to increase people's chance of voting, and it really probably will, and it will increase the sense that this is a high turnout election, which social science shows is like a good way to be associated with higher turnout. But also, there are still Republicans. There's actually media consumption habits are not nearly as segregated as people would think. If you look at the audience of people who, listen to pop music or who watch movies, they're at most going to be 60% Democratic. There are actually tons of low info swing voters, like even Fox News, 15% of the people who watch Fox News are going to be voting for Biden. So like going out there and having a high visibility people talk about you is just super good. So I think there's a lot of structural reasons to think they matter. There've also been some experiments. I think they're just basically always good, unless the person is like very unpopular, which can happen. But I think it's mostly good.
So moving on. After what happened in 2016, how reliable do you think the 2020 polls are? And related to that, is there a prediction that you'd make for 2020 that's contrary to conventional wisdom?
Yeah. So I'm going to make a different claim about 2020. So there's first thing about polling is obviously our polls in 2018 were great because we did stuff like try to adjust for social trust and whatever. But if you look at the public polls in 2018, people didn't notice because Democrats won and the polls said Democrats would win. But if you look by state, there was a pretty strong correspondence between how much public polls overestimated support in 2018 versus how much they overestimated support in 2016. So like just to give a concrete example, in West Virginia, people don't talk about it as much, but the public polls in West Virginia were actually wronger than any other state. I think the public polls had West Virginia at something like 38 to 40%, and then Clinton got 27%. Makes sense. Low education, right on the line, all of that stuff psychometrically. But going forward to 2018, there was a very close Senate race there, and the 538 in the public polls had had West Virginia at like plus 12 or plus 13, to the point where a lot of Republicans had totally written the race off. And the end result ended up being plus 2. And so this 10% gap, really just as much as it was there. And the reason is just that public, there were these pretty deep problems with 2016. I think the education weighting helps with a lot of it. Pollsters didn't weight by education, and now they do. But still, our research showed that weighting by education only does so much. Maybe explains something like half of the bias, but it's still, the reality is that people who are taking phone surveys are considerably higher SES and also more agreeable and higher trust across a wide range of dimensions. And so I would, even controlling for education. And so I would expect these same polling errors to kind of still happen. So I guess the counterintuitive advice I would give is, I think that paying a ton of attention to state polls is kind of a waste of time. In 2012, all the polling aggregators actually did substantially worse, or relatively worse, than 2008 plus uniform swing. I think the information I'd give is that, generally speaking, in an incumbent race, year-to-year correlations by state tend to be higher than in open races. And so 2012 and 2008, for example, were much more closely correlated than 2004 and 2008. And so I think that should give you a really, and at the same time, we know that polling has all of these problems, both particularly this cycle and also in general. And so my underrated advice is, rather than pay attention to state polls, I would assume that the state by state rank orders are going to be pretty similar to 2016, just because it's a year where an incumbent, because there's an incumbent in the race. And so then I would say, all right, well, in 2016, we would have needed to have won by 3 or 4 points in order to win, given the Electoral College. The Electoral College bias is probably going to be constant. So I would look at the national polls and say, like, if I wanted to know what's going to happen, I would look at the national polls and I would say, well, we need to be ahead by about 4 to 5% in order to comfortably win. And the polls can be off by about 2 points or something I think the average is 1.5 to 2 points. And so that means that in order for us to really be pretty sure, we should be up by like 6 or 7. And if we're closer than that, then it's going to be pretty close. And I think that that's like the model that I would use to keep track of things and check your blood pressure and know how much to worry, rather than trying to obsess over the different people arguing over different models, or freaking out about like one Wisconsin poll versus another Arizona poll. Like, I think our ability with public data to suss out changes from 2016 is very limited. It's all very noisy, and I would ignore it.
So a couple of questions from student teams and students interested in doing more. So if we're interested in working in political data science, do you have suggestions on where we could go to learn more? There's another one that says, do you have advice for the Michigan data science team, which is a really cool team, by the way. It did excellent work, for instance, a few years ago in Flint in terms of trying to predict individual home leads where there was a likelihood of a lead problem, and have done a number of other projects around in the community. And so if they wanted to start up a project on trying to build election models just to learn stuff and do stuff as a team, where do you think they could start? Generally, what advice do you have for somebody who's got some skills and wants to get deeper into this area?
Yeah, so I would, first of all, there's a ton of, for what it's worth, there are tons of down ballot campaigns in Michigan that are, it's not going to be super sexy work, but there's a lot of data cleaning, and there's a need for this stuff. I would really do a shout out to 2 particular groups, Ragtag and All Hands, which try to route volunteers to campaigns in a way that's helpful. All Hands in particular is probably more relevant on the data science side. So I would do that shout out. In terms of getting into the career, I think it's hard because the employers all shift every 2 years. Like the election happens and a bunch of people get fired, and it's kind of a cruel industry to work in a lot of ways. But I think I would, one, check out progressive data jobs, even if you're not immediately looking for jobs, because it gives you a really good sense of what kind of jobs are out there and what kind of work is getting done. In terms of skills, I think that, as always, I think this is the advice for all, data science job tasks, like, basic scripting knowledge and SQL is much more important. All like as well as like some DevOps skills, version control and all of that. That's like all much more valuable than like, fancy machine learning and data science stuff. In terms of how to get a sense of what's out there and how to learn more, honestly, I think a real feature of this space is that the people who are working on it in it are all super busy because politics is kind of very demanding. And so they don't write very much publicly, but something they do is tweet. And so, I think that there are some excellent people in this industry. Jonathan Robinson, for example, comes to mind. Otis Reed, Alexander Berger. Like there are some really smart, quantitatively minded folks. Also, Grossman, who I think goes to the University of Michigan, who has probably the single best political science, Twitter feed in the country, Matt Grossman. But yeah, I think Twitter is probably the best way to learn about this stuff. And also personally, if anyone ever wants to ask me questions, my Twitter DMs are open. So feel free to, I'm happy to chat through and answer questions in more detail. In terms of just getting started, in a partisan context, I would reach out to All Hands or Ragtag. In a non-partisan context, I think it would be, I think if you're going to volunteer, I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff around like polling locations and poll closings and early vote data. That's actually a good example. Is there's a lot of early vote data coming out by state. The data is a little messy, but there's like lots of interesting patterns. Voter files are actually publicly available in a bunch of places. Analyzing that is pretty underrated. The North Carolina voter file, for example, is available on their FTP server. So if you want to understand something about politics, that's literally millions of people with party registration and race and gender and geocodes. And so if I wanted to do some interesting stuff, that's actually what I would do. I would download the North Carolina voter file and play with it. Any other questions?
Yes, there are maybe another half a dozen if you have time. We'll squeeze as many as we can. How about Clinton's very big personal negatives in 2016? Is that really as irrelevant as one might assume, having heard your talk?
So I think that there's two different things that you can decompose. You can decompose the 2016 election in two ways. The first is that Barack Obama got 51.9% of the two-way vote in 2012, and Hillary Clinton got 51.1%. And so if nothing else changed, that would have been enough for her to win. The reason she lost is that the bias of the Electoral College, which you can define as basically you look at the tipping point state, which is the state that puts you over 50. It was Wisconsin in over 270. It was Wisconsin in 2016, and subtract that versus the overall mean. And when you do that, the Electoral College was about half a point biased in favor of Democrats in 2012, and suddenly became 3 points biased against Republicans. Against Democrats in 2016. The current Electoral College bias, if you draw it out, is not just larger than it's been at any point since World War II, but actually substantially larger. So this is a real point. I think that because Gore lost the Electoral College and won the popular vote, people have this idea that the Electoral College is fundamentally biased against Democrats. But the actual gap, the bias of the Electoral College in 2000 was actually pretty small. The 2016 election was a much larger divergence between the popular vote and the Electoral College. And I think that people don't realize that even though it didn't go the other way, if you calculate it this way, the Electoral College has actually been biased toward Democrats for pretty wide swaths, though by small amounts. It was for Barack Obama both times, it actually had a slight Democratic bias. So without this massive change in the bias of the Electoral College, Hillary would have won and won super comfortably. And so I think there's two phenomena. I think that if you fit some fundamentals model, Donald Trump was the most unpopular person to ever run for office. But the problem was that Hillary Clinton was the second most unpopular person to ever run for office. And so if you fit some fundamentals model, you can say, if Hillary hadn't been so unpopular, we would have gotten 54% instead of 51%, or maybe 53% instead of 51%, and we would have comfortably won. But the flip side of that is that without this kind of immigration, Trump, education realignment, then even at Hillary Clinton's current popularity, she would have comfortably won. And so I think that that's like an important story, because Hillary Clinton is not running in 2020, but these structural biases that came about from the 2016 election continue to exist. We saw them in 2018, which is why we don't control the Senate. We got 54% of the vote and lost seats. And these structural biases potentially might exist, after Trump too. And so that's the decomposition. There's like, what was our popular vote number? And that is a function of how popular Hillary was. And then what was this change in coalitions, which, causes differences in the bias of our structural biases of our institutions.
How about momentum? Can you target areas where the right direction of momentum gets you the start you need?
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
How about momentum in terms of looking at changes rather than the actual just the static numbers?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in politics, this is like the general problem with forecasting, is that there's two competing forces where momentum is a thing that clearly exists sometimes. Like, for example, West Virginia has become more Republican every single year consistently since 1988. It was 20% more Democratic than the country overall in 1988, and now is 20% more Republican. But the flip side is that mean reversion is also a very powerful force, where in general, if you look, states that trend against us tend to mean revert the next cycle. And so that's like kind of the problem with forecasting, is it's this constant battle between both momentum and mean reversion. And how you balance the two is like a tricky problem. Like in polling, one of the most underrated forecasting tricks is that if there's a big change, like if a candidate goes up in the polls, the most likely outcome is to just bet on things going in the opposite direction. But that doesn't mean momentum doesn't exist. There's structural forces that lead to both phenomena, and they're just kind of constantly in tension with each other. And that's true outside of politics too.
All right. We are getting close to time. We have a lot more questions.
I personally have a couple of minutes after this if people, I have some time, but I understand that, yeah.
All right, so let's do maybe 2 or 3 more questions and then we'll stop, right? So in terms of messages, do minority swing voters and white swing voters respond in generally the same way in terms of the same kinds of messages, turns everybody off, or is there
heterogeneity?
Yeah.
I think that there are in some ways. I think an important thing to remember about when you're thinking about African American voters is that the base rate is very high. 90 something percent of Black voters vote for Democrats, and so that means that if you're on the fence, if you're a marginal Black voter, you're going to have very different views. You're going to be in the top 6th percentile or 7th percentile of conservatism, while for white people you'll be at like the 60th, because we get like 40% of the white vote. And so there are some issues where it comes up, but something that we've seen pretty broadly is that the best issues, like talking about Medicare or talking about Social Security expansion, are so much better than the average issues that usually, like in the politics term, I like to say that micro-targeting is overrated. There was this idea in the industry, especially coming out of 2012, that like we were going to build all of these fancy heterogeneous treatment effect models, and we would talk about immigration to the immigration voters, and like choice to the choice voters, and environmental issues to the young people, and we would fit all these complicated models and do all this micro targeting. And I think there's two problems with that. The first is that we have a very adversarial media system, where if you go and you tell one crowd that you want to increase immigration levels, then the conservative media will find that and broadcast it to everyone. And so that really limits the gains of some of this targeting. But also we just found that there's a lot less heterogeneity than you would think. The most popular issues, I think, Medicare and Social Security expansion are the best testing messages for every single subgroup out there, I think, conceivable. They're just it's number one and number two for every single group. And there's a real question about number 15 varies a lot. Young people get more excited by climate change, or kind of counterintuitively, Hispanic voters, they actually are less responsive on immigration than white voters, but they care a lot about education relative to white voters. And then when it comes to African Americans, we see lead removal test particularly well among African Americans. We see mental health being something that works really well among non-college voters. Among non-white voters. But broadly speaking, that's all second-tier issues. When you talk to people, at least in this exact moment, basically everyone's top concern is kind of these broadly popular economic policies.
Thank you. Couple of state-specific questions, the extent you're able to.
Yeah, I'll try.
Is Pennsylvania really redder than Wisconsin and Michigan this cycle? And if so, why do you think that's the case? And with a likely exodus from California, do you think the Senate will have a strong Republican bias in 4 years?
Yeah, so there's 2 points here. The first thing is I'm gonna go back to say that my best guess I have access to a bunch of internal data and everything, so I have a different guess, but really, broadly speaking, you should bet on things being similar to 2016 and state rank orders being pretty similar to 2016. And so, when it comes to Pennsylvania versus Wisconsin or whatever, I just think, in 2016, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin were very similar. And so I suspect they won't be too dissimilar. They diverged somewhat a little bit in 2018, but not, not by a ton. But it's hard to know. There's a lot of noise. The fact that there's so much uncertainty about state-to-state swings is just an important thing that people should keep in mind. And then on the second question, it was about swing states. Something we've really noticed that I think is very interesting is that when people move, we've noticed that they tend to move, Democrats, when they leave red states, when Democrats tend to move to blue areas and Republicans tend to move to red areas. And so, what's pretty interesting about that is that overall, this is making things worse. I think that there's an interesting argument when you're talking about the Senate about plain states, about Alaska and Montana, but historically, migration from California to the plain states actually made those states more conservative. Democrats used to do pretty well in Montana, and a pretty underrated aspect of their decline has really been all of these Republicans moving in from California. That among native, I think that's an underrated aspect about these plain states is that because their base rate is so low, a very large fraction of their population were actually born outside of the state. But among people who were born in Montana, you see that even though they vote for Republicans federally, they tend to vote at high levels for Democrats on a state level, whether it's governor or state ledger or whatever. And that's why Montana had a all Democratic delegation pretty recently. But these conservatives who come in from California, they're higher income, they have lower ticket splitting rates, and they're kind of more down the line Republicans. And so it just kind of shows how predicting the future is hard. I don't know exactly how it would shake out. Obviously, if some tech billionaire decided to try to get a bunch of people to move to Missoula, it might work. But I will say that historically, one of the reasons why Democrats have done worse in kind of these plain states than they used to 20 years ago is actually, people moving from Republicans fleeing California. With coronavirus, it's a little different. It's hard to say, but I think that's some fun flavor. All right.
So last question. Would you care to comment on election models made by, major public sites, things like 538 or The Economist or whatever?
Yeah. So I have So I'm personally a big fan of Nate Silver. I did a little bit of brief work with him in 2011, and you know, he's been super nice, super nice. And I think he's actually, so I'd say about Nate Silver, I think he gets a lot of, I think a lot of people, he gets a lot of unfair criticism on the internet. I think from people who are like honestly a little jealous of his success. I personally think he's a very smart guy. His record on forecasting, I think, is pretty good. He, I don't agree with like all of the decisions that he makes, but he is someone who I think does think very carefully about predicting things for a living. And I think a lot of his critics don't do that. And so that's just like, you know, my first reaction when I see a lot of that. And then, you know, when you look at the Economist model being run by Elliot Morris, I mean, he's clearly a very smart, I mean, he's 23 or 20, he's like 23 right now, which is wild. So I think the work he's done is super impressive. I think, you know, if you want to guide, I think that there's, if you want to look at these two models, I know that they've had those two people who I both like, don't get along super well right now. I think that there's a very interesting divide where, you know, Nate Silver kind of represents this very like sports world where, you know, he's just trying to make predictions and bet on things. Like Nate Silver used to be a professional poker player. So he's like trying to create odds because he bets on things, you know, so it's very, and so he has like a less methodologically rigorous from a statistical perspective, but much more of an emphasis on say back testing or on, you know, coming up with lots of little hacky adjustments in order to deal with things as they come, which I mean that in a positive way, not a negative way. And, you know, Elliot Morris, I think also he does a great job of kind of distilling the political science literature in a way that I think Nate Silver doesn't. And so like in 2018, for example, you know, he looked through literature and produced a pretty compelling case that, you know, around the national environment way ahead of time in a way that I think, you know, the other approach wouldn't have done. And he's actually working with Andrew Gelman, who, if you know, in the Bayesian stats world, it's kind of like the big Bayesian stats king. And so I think, you know, there's this really interesting, like kind of statistician, political science versus like kind of applied, you know, get your hands dirty approach between the two, where like Nate Silver is like coming up with lots of, you know, kind of hacky adjustments around coronavirus and various things like that, and doing a lot of like very old school prediction for prediction's sake stuff, which I do admire. And then kind of Elliot Morris is really bringing in some, I think, best in class stats and political science stuff. So it's super interesting. Amusingly, they both produce pretty similar answers right now. But just from a pure practitioner perspective, it's fun to watch them both go at it. And I have a lot of respect for both of them. So
thank you so much, David. One final request from listeners. If people want to follow your work, do you have, is there an easy way to get links to your published papers or things of this nature? Is there something that you could give us? Or
yeah, so I am David Shor, SHOR on Twitter. So my DMs are open if anyone ever wants to. One, I do post a lot of stuff there. Obviously that got me in some trouble, but I'm fairly active on Twitter. And then if anybody wants to chat, you know, please reach out. Happy to. I mean, to be clear, it might be a little delayed until the election. Everyone in my industry is very busy, but in general, I'll try to respond. Very happy to chat with people.
Thank you very much, David. That was a really fascinating talk. And as you can see, there were lots of engagement and lots of questions. I'm sure there'll be a lot of discussion following on. Thanks for spending time with us.
Oh, thank you.
And bye, everyone, and see you next week.